Welcome to episode 4 of the Filmmaking Through Music podcast. My name is John Wader. I am your host, and I am here on a mission to help you as a filmmaker, film director, film producer, videographer, have a more commercially appealing film that reaches a wider audience through the effective use of emotional and narrative-driven music that is aligned to the story and vision of your film. This podcast is centered around providing you with the approaches, the frameworks, and the models in order to achieve just that. And today we are going to start talking about a topic that I'm sure will be a recurring episode, and that is around budgeting for your film score. And so today is going to be a getting started with your film score budgeting episode because let's face it, most filmmakers struggle quite a bit in budgeting as a whole. It's a skill, it's a challenge, right? That's why you hire a line producer most of the time for this. But there are parts of the filmmaking process that seem to be a little bit more challenging to budget for, such as your film composer and your film score itself. When it comes to location rentals and equipment rentals and anyone working in a union, right, things are much more standard. However, when it comes to music, there's a couple of nuances that make it a less clear way, and I hope that I can clarify that for you a bit on this episode. So my goal with this episode is for you to walk away with just the practical steps and more actionable advice that will help you get through that budgeting phase for your film score and the music for your film. Like I said, this is a getting started episode, so we're going to keep it a little bit more brief for this one, and then I would really love to hear that feedback from you all. And I, of course, would love to double click into maybe a couple. Like I said, this is a getting started episode, so we're not going to go on for too long, but let's jump right in with a quick myth that I want to just debunk really quickly before getting into everything, and that's film composers and film scores are a set percentage of an overall film budget. And for some reason, you can see this information, this misinformation really, and for some reason, this information still circulates online that, you know, your film score or the music budget is 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 10, whatever percentage of the overall budget, and that's just simply not true. That is not how the industry works today. It may be set that way for some projects, or it may be a way to get to a starting point, and that may have been more likely in the past. And that doesn't really even make sense today. It just doesn't quite work like that, and we'll get into why in our sort of first factor that you want to consider there. But overall, I really want you to consider, like, what is the cost of not being able to budget for your film score? It's basically like saying what is this film going to look like if I can't complete it? And so that's why it's really important to kind of have that budget set in place from the beginning, because film scoring, film composing, is a majority post-production process. So you've already spent a lot of money, but I'm not here to give an episode, but that's why you're budgeting for the entire film from the get-go, not just for pre-production, not just for production, not just for post-production. You need to have that budget from end to end from day one, because if you're overspending earlier on, that's going to lead you to budgetary constraints when it comes to music, resulting in a soundtrack that is not going to maybe meet your needs. So really the prologue, the prologue to even all these budgeting factors or getting started with your budget is don't forget the budget for your film score to begin with. So you're probably hiring a line producer early on, or you're doing the budget yourself, but make sure you have that end-to-end budget. It's not just on-set crew, casting, catering. It's not just cast, crew, catering, locations, equipment for production. But from day one, make sure you're understanding what you have to get into for post-production as well, especially for music. I do see it kind of as a gap or a mistake that a lot of filmmakers make, is just kind of forgetting that forgetting that film score budget in the first place, because it can come across as an afterthought to some smaller productions. And obviously post-production is going to be budgeted separately, but failing to understand, research your original music needs early on, again, can really lead you to a film score and a film music that is not meeting the expectation that your film needs, which of course is going to bring down the overall perception of that film, which is again the opposite of what I want you to have which is the opposite of what I want you to achieve, a commercially appealing film, wider audience with narrative and emotionally driven music that is aligned to that story. So prologue, tip number 0, I guess I would say, is make sure you're setting that budget to begin with. But I mentioned that it's not a set percentage of the overall budget, and I said that the first reason was what we'll get into that. And that is because there is so much cost variability with film scores. And that is because composers are often paid based on their perceived market value. It is very much based on their experience, their brand, because we as composers do not have set rates, set standards. There is no union. So most, if not all, other roles in film are going to have some sort of set union rate. And so even if you're on a non-union project, you might be trying to be around there to begin with, or at least gives you a ballpark of what to expect or what you should expect at a certain level. That does not exist for composers. And so right up front, the composer that you're going to work with, their fee is going to greatly depend on their experience and their reputation and their past projects. That alone is a challenge that makes it hard for filmmakers to budget for film composers to begin with. Goes back to, again, something that I'm very adamant on is bring your composers on early, aka when you actually are budgeting, to get an idea of what you can actually afford. Okay, second factor to consider when you're setting up your budget for your film score is the scope of work. So that is just really, that to me is really focused on total runtime of your film. I have worked on, at the time of recording this podcast, well over 15 different short films and feature films, and the total runtime really has been the factor, in my opinion, that has impacted the scope of work and the level of effort. And it makes sense. A 10-minute short film is significantly less effort for me than a 90-minute feature film. And so it's not just, 10 minutes, 90 minutes, that's 9 times the work. It doesn't quite, work out like that. But the total runtime is really what I like to gather, estimated total runtime, of course, because that changes. But that estimated total runtime is really a huge factor for me when helping filmmakers decide their film score budget. Other sub-factors under scope of work is going to be kind of the complexity factor, complexity, genre, style. That's kind of all in one thing there. Third factor that I want you to consider when setting up the budget for your film score is what rights and licensing you will have for that music. Now, I'm not talking about licensing existing songs, right? Say that you want to have a big end credit song from a popular artist, but it's the rights of the film score itself. Because you're hiring someone to create music, so they own the intellectual property because they are creating it, they're writing it, they're recording it, but you're paying them to do that. You're hiring them to do that. So it effectively looks very similar to what a record label would be doing. A record label is paying the artist to go in to record their songs that they wrote, but they're funding the recording of that. And that is similar to what it looks like for film composers. And so that's where we get into the copyright of that film score. So as the production company, you need to have the rights to use that film score. And so that is why typically it is standard on what I'll call an adequately funded project. It is standard that the production company would own all of the publishing rights for the film score, and the film composer and their team would own all of the songwriting rights for that film score. So it's basically a 50-50 split. However, not every project might be, like I said, adequately funded or properly funded. And so maybe those publishing rights might stay with the composer, right? Because that feeds into royalty collections as well. And so that is something that I always consider on projects of if they're properly funded, then yes, we'll do a 50-50 split. But it's best practice that if a project is not fully funded, those publishing rights might stay with the composer, and therefore it's a licensing agreement for the film score on your film. And I'm no lawyer, of course. I can only speak from my experience working on films and dealing with these negotiations. And so my takeaway there for you is if you are not able to fully meet a composer's rate, then you likely aren't going to be able to kind of own the publishing for that. And so the composer will be licensing that film score to you. Probably the biggest X factor in additional expenses for your film score and your film composer is going to be live recording expenses. These can add up very quickly for every project. And that's because you are bringing in a lot of other people. On episode 3, I mentioned some of the roles that would be on a composer's team to debunk the myth that film composers work alone or it's a solo person's job. And a lot of those extra roles come into play when you do have live recording, because you are hiring additional folks to create sheet music. You're of course you're booking a studio. You're hiring an engineer to run that studio. You're hiring live musicians to play. You might be hiring a conductor to conduct them play. You're going to be hiring someone to mix the film score if it's not going to be done by your composer or your sound editor. So live recording is something that I always tell my film directors, hey, here's what it looks like. Here's what we can do with that. But again, that's going to be a separate piece of the budget. So it's a great privilege to be able to do any sort of live recording on independent projects. This episode is not meant to be all-encompassing of every little line item that's going to go into your film score budget. Like I said, this is more of a getting started high-level overview episode, but a couple additional factors that I definitely want to share with you all that I always take into consideration is PR budget and festival attendance. So again, There's a reason that films have a marketing budget and the production budget, and they often look very similar. And so I'm a big believer in the power of marketing and public relations. So having a little bit of PR budget set aside specifically for your film score and your film composer can really help build up the anticipation for your film and get the word out there, both for, again, the PR for the composer and for the film score is PR and promotion for the film itself. And like I said, festival attendance, again, that's going to be a very niche scenario, and maybe you're able to provide transportation and lodging to a major film festival if applicable. So once again, getting started episode, high-level overview, just quickly run down the recap there. Your prologue takeaway right here is don't forget the budget itself. Make sure you're setting your film score and your film composer budget as you're setting the budget for everything else. And first factor, remember the cost variability in hiring a composer. There's no union, there's no standard rates. So you're looking at based on market value, past experiences, and of course, personal fit as well. I have an episode coming up about hiring a composer and the factors you want to consider. Second item that you want to consider here when budgeting for your film score is the scope of work. Really, total runtime is, I think, that if you could just take away one thing from this section, is just total runtime. Longer film, expect to pay more for your film composer. Third is that rights and licensing. If you're able to fund that full rate, you're going to be splitting that 50-50 with the publishing and the songwriting on two sides of that. And if not, don't expect to kind of have all that publishing. It would be just more of a license agreement. 4 is your live recording expenses. That's going to significantly increase your budget. So if you're a filmmaker that know that from day one that you want a live orchestra for this, you've got to really be prepared to see what those expenses look like and use your composer to come up with those rates as well, right? That's a service that I certainly bring to all my projects of here's what it would look like if we would hire this size orchestra or these types of players. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you have not checked out the first couple episodes of this podcast, please do so. Or if you want to see even shorter tidbits and whatnot and social clips, you can check out my Instagram link in the show notes, and you can see some shorter 15 to 60 second videos from various episodes of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Happy filmmaking.